With only 2 feature films under her belt, Coralie Fargeat has already carved out a distinct cinematic style. Saturated colours, excessive blood, extreme close-ups, and a persistent focus on the female body. Of course, the female body is no stranger to horror, but more often than not it's presented in ways that few would call feminist. As a horror fan, I've long grown accustomed to enjoying films in spite of their poor representation of women. I love the Evil Dead franchise, but the infamous tree rape scene in the first film remains inexcusable. Slashers are one of my favourite subgenres, yet the amount of female nudity often feels, at best eye-roll worthy and at worst, deeply exploitative. And don't even get me started on rape revenge films. I consider myself a pretty tough horror fan. Very little genuinely disturbs me anymore. But rape revenge films are usually a hard no. The subgenre has long been one of horror's most controversial, and for good reason. Early examples depicted sexual violence in ways that felt deeply exploitative, lingering shots, gratuitous nudity, and a focus on the trauma rather than any true catharsis. So when Revenge was released in 2017, I didn't rush to see it. The plot synopsis alone was enough to put me off. But once reviews started trickling in, my curiosity was sparked. With a female director at the helm, Revenge seemed to share my exact view on the rape revenge formula, and promised to subvert this from within. But how was that even possible? How could a film remain within such a trite and troubling subgenre, and still manage to critique it? The answer, it turns out, lies in what has become Fargeat's signature move, playing with our expectations. More specifically, by playing with the male gaze. Her most recent film, The Substance, pushes this even further. A gruesome, body horror satire of celebrity culture and impossible beauty standards. It continues her fascination with the female form in film, but this time it's less about survival and more about self-destruction, where Revenge reclaimed the rape revenge narrative by weaponizing the very tropes that have historically undermined women. The Substance takes aim at the broader systems that commodify, control, and ultimately punish the female body. Both films feature graphic body horror, surreal stylization, and a kind of visceral feminism that dares you to look, and demands you to then reconsider what you're seeing. Together, Revenge and The Substance show Fargeat's growing mastery not just of horror, but of how to manipulate its gaze. She doesn't reject the genre's history. Instead, she retools it, subverts it, and uses it against itself. The key and most controversial way she does this is by utilising the male gaze. The male gaze is a film theory that has recently gained a lot of traction online. Unfortunately, as when most things seep their way into online discourse, the term has largely lost its true meaning. TikTok is littered with videos of people dressing for the male gaze versus the female gaze, essentially boiling the concept down to either presenting yourself in a way that men find attractive or rejecting that entirely. But the gaze does not work like this. It cannot be inverted to produce a female gaze. The male gaze is not about literal men looking at women. It's a media theory about how systems of power shape what is seen and how it is seen. The male gaze is a term coined by film theorist Laura Mulvey, and it describes how women are often represented in film and visual media through a heterosexual male perspective. In this system, women are shown as passive objects of desire, meant to be looked at, while men are active characters who look and control the story. The male gaze is a framework of representation. It's how the media has trained us to see, how women are depicted, and how women learn to depict themselves. Reducing the concept to sexual attraction strips it of its critical power. The gaze is not just male, it is structural. It's not about literal looking. Instead, it's about how visual culture assigns value. In media, masculinity is linked to agency, action, and status. Femininity, instead, is linked to appearance, desirability, and passive display. With this, key elements of the male gaze in film are the fragmentation of women's bodies via close-ups, limited agency and development for female characters, and the reinforcing of gender stereotypes and beauty standards. So, with this now defined, how can Fargeat's world of boobs, butts, and supermodel-esque women possibly be anything but a perfect male gaze fantasy? Well, it's in how she plays with this idea. After The Substance premiered, many viewers questioned how such a hypersexualized, visually provocative film could be called feminist. Much of this confusion stems from a misunderstanding of how the film uses the male gaze. Coralie Fargeat's work in both Revenge and The Substance deliberately engages with the male gaze, not to indulge in it, but to expose and critique it. In Revenge, we are immediately placed in a world filtered through a male perspective. The film opens with a stylized aerial shot of the desert, which then cuts to a mirrored reflection in Richard's sunglasses, literally showing us the world through his eyes. Jen, his much younger lover, steps out of a helicopter wearing pink and sucking on a lollipop. The camera lingers on her legs and pans up her body. She is fragmented, hypersexualized, and reduced to an object of desire. This familiar visual language recalls decades of film. But Jen is not oblivious. She uses her sexuality to her advantage, dancing, flirting, and teasing. But still, this power is precarious. Her confidence within the male gaze ultimately offers no protection when that gaze turns violent. The Substance takes a slightly more satirical approach. Margaret Qualley plays Sue, the younger, idealized version of Elizabeth Sparkle, a former TV fitness host desperate to stay relevant and played by Demi Moore. The film is packed with extreme close-ups as Sue performs in a tiny pink leotard. These images mimic the glossy aesthetic of 1980s aerobics tapes, exaggerated to an absurd, grotesque degree. In scenes like the Pump It Up routine, the male gaze is so over the top that it stops being erotic and starts being disturbing. The parody here is unmistakable. Yet like Jen, Sue is not naive. She has already lived Elizabeth's life and knows that in this world, desirability equals worth. Thus, she embraces her objectification, even knowing what happens when it runs out. Fargeat uses this complicity to show just how deep the gaze runs. It's not just about how women are looked at, but how they learn to look at themselves. Elizabeth and Sue know nothing else but to play into this gaze. Thus, in both Revenge and The Substance, the male gaze is not merely replicated, it's weaponized. Fargeat overtly mirrors the way that women are visually consumed in the media, and in the over-the-top way she does this, she makes the gaze visible and impossible to ignore. Her films suggest that feminism on screen does not require modesty or restraint. Instead, it requires intention. Through deliberate excess, satire, and reversal, she dismantles the gaze from the inside out. It's so over the top that it stops being erotic and starts being disturbing. But that's not where the disturbing elements end. No, once the scenes of eroticism have been set, big shifts occur in both films. In both The Substance and Revenge, trauma is catalyzed by a failure to satisfy the male gaze. In The Substance, Elizabeth Sparkle's trauma is set in motion not with violence, but with erasure. Once a beloved media personality, Elizabeth is discarded the moment her body begins to show signs of age. What's ironic and deeply telling is that Elizabeth is still beautiful by any reasonable standard. But in a culture calibrated to the male gaze, her beauty no longer matters once it falls outside the rigid bounds of youthfulness. Elizabeth's trauma is thus rooted in the cruel absurdity of the standard she is being held to. Her punishment is not simply for being unattractive, it's for failing to maintain an impossible ideal. This becomes even more glaring when juxtaposed with Harvey, whose aging body is shot in stomach-churning close-ups as he shovels shrimp into his mouth with sauce dripping down his fingers. Harvey is grotesque inside and out. Yet he continues to hold power. His ugliness is not a liability, it's irrelevant. He is allowed to age, be crude, and to lose any visual appeal, but he can still command respect and authority. Elizabeth, by contrast, is forced to confront a world that discards her despite her enduring beauty, solely based on the fact that she no longer appears young enough to feed the male gaze. The humiliation she suffers at Harvey's hands is not just professional, it's existential. Alone in her home, surrounded by relics of her former fame, she becomes a ghost in her own life, stripped of agency, companionship, and worth. Even when given the option of companionship, a date with a man who still finds Elizabeth attractive, she cannot escape the gaze and thus does not allow herself to go. It is the discarding by the Hollywood system that once built her up that pushes Elizabeth to use the titular substance. The miracle injection that allows Elizabeth to generate a younger, more desirable version of herself, Sue. In Revenge, trauma arrives even more explicitly, with the male gaze already having set the stage when Jen turns down Stan's advances as subconscious is already fearful of what we will see. With his fantasy shattered, things turn violent. But unlike in past rape revenge films, the rape unfolds entirely off-screen, conveyed instead through sound and implication. Jen's screams echo through the house while Dimitri, unmoved, turns up the TV and eats a candy bar, a chilling image of passive complicity. The camera pulls back from the closed bedroom door, refusing to exploit Jen's trauma. Fargeat's belief that sometimes what is shown off screen can be even more violent plays out with haunting effectiveness here. By refusing to show the assault, Revenge rejects the genre's tradition of spectacle and voyeurism, and in doing so reorients our gaze, from titillation to empathy. Unlike in past rape revenge films, such as I Spit on Your Grave, Fargeat doesn't reduce Jen to a victim or an object of pity. The trauma transforms her, but not into a fetishized figure of revenge. Instead, the film's visual language shifts entirely, moving from glossy male fantasy to a raw, empowered narrative of reclamation. For those that like a bit of gore, this is where things start to get good. In In Revenge, transformation begins with Jen's literal and symbolic rebirth. After being raped and left for dead, she emerges from a brutal wound, impaled and bloodied, only to pull herself off a stake, brand her body with a phoenix symbol, and crawl out of a cave transformed. It's not a quiet recovery, but a mythic metamorphosis, shown in surreal, hyper-stylized visuals that nod to genre films like Mad Max and Kill Bill. Fargeat's use of saturated blues and hot pinks enhances the surreal, heightened tone of this world, one where trauma breeds not just survival, but reinvention. Jen's transformation is physical, psychological, and cinematic. Her body, wounded and remade, becomes a site of resistance rather than objectification. Crucially, her resistive violence is not filmed erotically, where pre-rape Jen was shot through the lens of objectification, fragmented and overly sexualized. The post-rape Jen is filmed through movement, pain, and action. Her body, though still scantily clad, is no longer sexualized. Instead, its dirt, sweat, and blood speak to endurance and power. Here, the hunted becomes the hunter, literally watching the men through binoculars and rifle scopes. In The Substance, transformation is achieved through grotesque, clinical body horror. Elizabeth injects herself with the chemical promise of youth, and what follows is not renewal but destruction. Her skin tears and her spine unzips and her flesh contorts with agonizing precision. This is not death, but brutal self-erasure, a reconfiguration of the body that mimics the surgeries, rituals, and expectations that women endure to remain desirable. From this carnage, Sue emerges, nude, slimy, and eerily perfect. She is not born but manufactured, a product of societal pressure rather than biological rebirth. The surreal aesthetic here is key. Coralie Fargeat cloaks The Substance in candy-coloured nightmare tones, saturated pink and neon green, and this mimics the gloss of beauty advertising while undercutting it with grotesque violence. The transformation that produces Sue is not framed as empowerment, but as annihilation. Sue immediately stitches Elizabeth's gaping back wound, a chilling gesture that reduces the process to cold efficiency. The metaphor is clear. Women are expected to destroy themselves neatly and quietly in order to be reborn into something consumable. Both films position transformation not as triumph, but as a response to systemic violence, the cost of failing to conform to the male gaze. But the violence eventually gets flipped around, as the women turn from objects to subjects. In both Revenge and The Substance, violence and gore radically subvert the male gaze by turning the camera against systems that commodify, eroticize, and control female bodies, transforming symbols of objectification into instruments of resistance. In Revenge, the violence is surreal and excessive, functioning as a poetic retaliation against a system that once demanded Jen's passivity. Her first kill, stabbing Dimitri through the eyes, literally annihilates the lens through which he was previously watched and objectified. The weapons she uses are stolen from the men who hunted her. Oversized rifles, icons of masculine power, now grotesquely reappropriated into tools of feminist vengeance. In the film's final act, Richard, once a patriarchal symbol of dominance, is reduced to a naked, bleeding victim, pursued by Jen through a corridor soaked in blood. When she ultimately impales him, it mirrors her earlier wound, turning the penetration into a metaphor of retribution. The last shot, a slow pan of Jen's blood-drenched body as she stares directly into the camera, denies closure and forces the viewer to reckon with the structures that demanded her objectification and survival. Unlike traditional rape revenge narratives, Revenge refuses the fantasy that violence simply erases trauma. Her transformation has been profound, but not redemptive. She is changed, but not free. The bloodbath may be over, but the consequences remain unspoken. In The Substance, Coralie Fargeat weaponizes gore not as mere spectacle, but as a visceral critique of the culture of beauty and female disposability. Gore replaces eroticism. Where the camera once lingered to sexualize female flesh, it now fixates on close-ups of blood and bodily collapse. The leering lens is turned back in on itself. If audiences once consumed women's bodies for pleasure, they are now confronted with the grotesque consequences of that consumption. Now, this is where a large critique of the film comes in, by seeing the bodies we are supposed to find grotesque as aged female bodies. In the final act of the film, with Sue having abused the balance of The Substance, Elizabeth is transformed into a hunched and elderly woman, but the aged version of Elizabeth defies the conventions of exploitation by presenting her not as a grotesque caricature of decay, but as a complex and humanized figure grappling with a societal obsession with youth and beauty, the things we have all been forced to grapple with throughout the film. Her body is not simply a result of age, it is a result of abusing herself to try to satisfy the male gaze. Age is not horror. It is an inevitable consequence for all of us who get to live so long. The aged body is only horrifying because it is hidden. To me, Fargeat is not asking us to recoil at this new Elizabeth. Instead, she is asking us to contend with why we are less comfortable seeing a sagging body than an over-sexualized one. Throughout the film, it is the young body of Sue which we see suffer from the most gore. She unzips her insides, pulls a chicken wing out of her belly button, and eventually loses her teeth and ear. Are we really all more comfortable seeing this than an elderly woman? Unfortunately, yes. Even Elizabeth herself cannot end the trauma and kill Sue. She needs her beauty, gore and all. The film could have ended with all of this and the message would still have worked. But to the joy of some and the displeasure of others, the film decides to go all out in the finale and really hammer the message home. The horror reaches its peak in the monstrous fusion of identities into Monstro Elizasu, a grotesque hybrid born of desperation, rage, and the impossible demand to be both visible and ageless. This figure is not a villain, but a victim, contorted by a society that punishes women for aging out of desirability. Even in her barely human form, twisting and pulsating with trauma, Monstro Elizasu still pauses to beautify herself. A final, tragic gesture to try and remain palatable. Monstro Elizasu steps out onto the stage ready to perform to an audience of men, women, and children. This audience, all too happy to leer at the topless women behind her, are then met with a horrifying display. A mutilated breast drops from Monstro Elizasu, and a mother covers her daughter's eyes. Okay with this child learning to sexualize herself, but not okay with her seeing this woman's pain. What follows is grotesque and deliberately alienating, a defiant refusal to sanitize female pain for the viewer's comfort. Coralie Fargeat refused to soften this vision, rejecting Universal's demands for edits and instead choosing Mubi for distribution, maintaining control over every unflinching moment. Blood gushes on screen, drowning everyone in the horror. But this grotesque excess is not gratuitous. It's the logical, horrifying endpoint of Elizabeth's objectification. The gore becomes catharsis as much as spectacle, an obliteration of the image and a rupture of the gaze. With this, we have been forced to confront the way women's bodies are consumed, not just by the audience in the film, but by us. It's no accident that the audience within the film, cheering, indifferent, and complicit, are not just men, they're everyone. The message is clear. The gaze belongs to all of us. In Revenge and the Substance, gore is never incidental. It is political, purposeful, and deeply subversive. It exposes the realities women are taught to conceal: blood, pain, decay, and endurance. From menstruation to childbirth to the slow violence of beauty standards, the female body is already a site of rupture. Yet mainstream media relentlessly sanitizes this experience, rendering period blood blue and shaving already smooth legs, to preserve a palatable, consumable female ideal. What makes Fargeat's gore so radically disruptive isn't just its intensity, but its honesty. These films tear through the illusion of a pristine, passive female body. Though the violence crescendos to operatic extremes, neither film deliver a cathartic resolution. Instead, audiences are left in the wreckage, forced to confront not only the brutality on screen, but the cultural gaze that demands such brutality to begin with. Revenge and the Substance are not merely horror films. They are autopsies of the male gaze. Through hyper-stylized violence and visceral body horror, Fargeat doesn't just represent systems of objectification, she dissects them. Rather than rejecting the visual language of the gaze, she weaponizes it, shifting the female body from a passive image to a volatile terrain of resistance and rupture. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know, do you agree with this interpretation of Revenge and the Substance? I think both films are deeply interesting, and therefore I'm sure some people have some pretty good counter-arguments. Or maybe some more supporting ones that I've missed. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my previous videos.